Okay, so today we're really going deep. We're tackling this idea, this question that's been out there. Did the Biden administration, did they actually try to cover up concerns about President Biden's mental health? We've got a ton of stuff to go through, news articles, reports, some of it's pretty in-depth, even some social media chatter. We got to figure out, like, what's real here.
Yeah, this is a big one, right? I mean, President Biden, he starts his presidency, oldest person ever to take office, 78. So right away, people are talking about his age, and as things go on, those questions about his mental sharpness, they don't go away.
No, they definitely don't. And look, everyone's seen the headlines, right? We're not just going to rehash those. What we're going to try to do is step back, get a clearer picture. Were these concerns like really based on things people saw and heard, or was it all just politics? And this is the big one, right?
hmm
Did the administration actually hide stuff from everyone?
That's what we're digging into. And I think it's important to remember, this didn't just pop up once he was in the White House. This actually goes back, way back.
Oh, for sure. If you look back at like the 2020 campaign, when he was running, his age was a thing. He was 76 during those primaries. Even some people in his own party, they were bringing it up. It wasn't just the Republicans. And there were these articles, big newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, even back in like 2019, they were talking about his age. Sometimes he'd slip up when he was talking.
Exactly. And a lot of his supporters back then, they called it ageism, right? They said, look, this is just an attack because of his age. But still, those questions, they were kind of already out there.
They were. And once he got into office, there were definitely some moments that made those questions even louder.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like November 2021, the climate change summit. It was a
Yeah.
big deal. And then, there's that clip of him, looks like he's falling asleep. That went viral
Oh,
fast.
yeah. That was everywhere. And then I remember Politico did a poll right after, and it said almost half, like 48% of voters, they didn't think he was mentally fit.
Oh,
It's crazy how, like, one moment, a few seconds on camera, can really change how people see things.
absolutely. And, then there was that Easter egg roll at the White House in 2022. Remember that? The staffer dressed as the Easter bunny, kind of steering President Biden away from the press.
I do. And it was all over the internet. Millions of views. Even the press secretary for Republican Senator Josh Hawley, she was asking about it publicly. It kind of felt like, oh, maybe they are trying to manage him carefully.
Right, like shield him a little. And as we get into 2023, these concerns, they don't fade away. That poll the Washington Post and ABC News did in May, over 60%, more than half of Americans, they had doubts about his mental sharpness, his health. And it's interesting, right? Trump's only a couple years younger, but he wasn't facing those same levels of concern in that poll.
Right. And it's 2023 when we start to see more of those, verbal gaffes, like mixing up Super Tuesday and Super Thursday, or times where he seemed to struggle remembering stuff. The conservative media, they jumped on those, said it was cognitive decline, but it wasn't just them. There was that speech in 2023. Some media, they described it as soft, muffled, and meandering. Even the Washington Post, they said, okay, maybe some of this is political, but they also said these concerns are out there. It was becoming a bigger story.
And then in 2024, things take a big turn with the whole Robert Hur report, February 2024. Now, remember, Hur was the special counsel investigating the classified documents situation, right? And he doesn't end up recommending criminal charges, but his report, it described Biden as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. And it went on to say Biden had trouble remembering important dates, like his years as a vice president or even the year his son Beau died. And this, even though it wasn't a legal thing, it had a real political impact.
It did. It really did. It was like those concerns people already had, they suddenly got validated. And then June 2024, the presidential debate. A lot of people criticized his performance. They said he was losing his train of thought, things like that. It was around that time, Carl Bernstein, he's reporting on CNN, he's saying even Biden's allies are noticing marked incidents of cognitive decline.
And then you've got foreign leaders, privately, they're describing him as frail, confused. So it's not just a domestic thing anymore. This perception is international.
It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
were things fine at the start and then went downhill? Or were there issues all along and they were trying to hide them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where the whole cover-up idea starts to feel more believable. You start looking at how the administration, how they handled Biden's public appearances, his interactions, and it gets interesting.
Like that Wall Street Journal report, July 2024. Tons of interviews with people on the inside. They were saying the White House was limiting his schedule, his direct interactions, especially anything unscripted with the media. And this was happening, get this, as early as 2021. And they even admitted, these insiders, they said there were good days and bad days. Makes you think, Were they trying to control things from the get-go?
It does. And CNN, they're reporting around the same time that White House reporters, they felt they could have pushed harder on these health questions, but they were getting resistance. It was like the administration was keeping Biden at a distance,
Right.
controlled. And then there's data from Martha Joint Kumar. She tracks this stuff. She was saying, yeah, fewer formal press conferences, fewer interviews, but way more informal interactions, like 588 by mid-2024. Right, more controlled settings. But then, December 2024, the Wall Street Journal drops this big investigation. They're saying aides were managing Biden's, cognitive struggles right from the start, January 2021. They're talking about adjusting his schedule based on his energy levels, hiring a voice coach, even filtering what news he was getting.
Wow. That's a lot of intervention. It really does make you think, were they trying to hide something?
Doesn't it? And then there's the preparation for the Her interview back in October 2023. There are reports saying that Biden, he really struggled to remember things during those prep sessions, even basic things like what year his son died. That's concerning.
It is, especially since the public didn't know about any of this. And speaking of things the public didn't know, that 2023 speech, the one we talked about earlier, the one that caused so much buzz, some people said it was just fatigue or his stutter, but it led to a lot of people calling for a cognitive exam, and he refused.
He did. And he said that his daily duties were proof enough that he was cognitively fit. But for a lot of people, that wasn't good enough. The White House, they said it was all political, that some clips were edited to make him look bad. But those concerns about his fitness, they didn't just disappear.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
There was that interview he did in 2024 where he just seemed lost, confused. And remember what Carl Bernstein reported? He said that people inside the administration, they were raising concerns with Ron Klain, Biden's chief of staff, way before that 2024 debate. This wasn't a new thing for them.
Not at all. And if you look at the official responses from the administration, you have Jen Psaki dodging questions in 2022, Biden himself coming out strong in February 2024 saying, I know what the hell I'm doing. But then you have these reports about them limiting his exposure, managing his schedule. It just doesn't add up.
Right. If everything was fine, why all the secrecy? This is the presidency we're talking about. People have a right to know if the person in charge is, up for the job, physically and mentally.
Of course. And, experts have weighed in on this too. Professor Nicholas Sherburne, he's pointed out that you can see changes in someone's health, their cognition, just by watching videos, but you can't diagnose anything without a real medical exam. So it's tricky, right? We can't jump to conclusions, but we can ask questions when we see a pattern.
Right. And that's all people were doing, asking questions. And it's interesting to think about, history. Like that Forbes article, they compared this whole thing to Woodrow Wilson back in 1919. He had a stroke, and they tried to keep it quiet.
Exactly. And in both cases, it raises these questions. Who's really running things? If the president's health is failing, are unelected staff making the big decisions?
That's a scary thought. And remember, the presidency, it's intense. Biden was dealing with COVID, the war in Ukraine, the economy, all that stress on top of just getting older. It can't be easy. The White House put out this fact sheet about the national mental health crisis, talked about investments, but there's nothing to suggest that Biden himself sought help.
And then, of course, you have to factor in the media. And the coverage on this, it was all over the map. Very polarized.
Definitely. Conservative outlets, Fox News, Sean Hannity, they were talking about confusion, fatigue, rapid aging, way back in 2020. They were pushing the decline narrative hard from the very beginning.
But this wasn't just Fox News. The Guardian, in 2023, they were talking about how these concerns, they were becoming mainstream. That Washington Post ABC News poll, only 32% of Americans thought Biden had mental sharpness. And even CNN, after the Her report came out, they admitted they might have been a little too cautious in their reporting.
Right, maybe they held back. And it's interesting, when you look at the different approaches, the Washington Post back in 2022, they wrote this article defending Biden. They said some of his slip-ups were just his stutter, and that you need a massive conspiracy to believe the whole decline thing.
Right. But then you have the Wall Street Journal, they're reporting later that there might have been a coordinated effort to manage his image, maybe even a cover-up.
And then you add social media to the mix. All those posts on X, some supporting him, some really critical. It just shows you how divided people were.
It does. And the White House, their whole response was to push back, say it was all political, say Biden was being unfairly targeted compared to Trump, whose statements, often raised eyebrows too. But that might have actually backfired because it could have discouraged deeper investigations.
Right. So what do we make of all of this? Was there really a cover-up, or was it all just politics?
Honestly, it's probably a mix of both.
I think so, too. I mean, he was 82. Being president is incredibly demanding. There's that article in The New Yorker that talked about how aging just affects your body, your mind.
Yeah.
It's real. And her report, the things people inside the White House were saying, it does seem like Biden was having some cognitive issues.
He was. But on the other hand, you can't ignore how much of this was driven by politics. Conservative media, Republicans, they never let up on his age. They used some clips in misleading ways, even twisted his stutter to make him look bad. It was definitely a strategy.
For sure. But the administration, they didn't help themselves. They weren't transparent. They tried to hide things, and that just fueled the fire. It's like the Wilson cover-up all over again.
Yeah, and that lack of transparency makes it hard to separate what was a real concern from what was just a political attack.
Exactly. So what have we learned from all of this?
I think it shows just how complicated this whole issue is. Trying to figure out if a leader is fit for office, it's tough. And when you have an administration that's not being open and honest, it makes it even harder.
Right, and this whole thing, it really damaged people's trust. It makes you wonder, how do we balance the need to scrutinize our leaders, make sure they're up to the job, with the risk of turning it into a political circus? And how much transparency should we expect?
Big questions. Something to really think about even after this deep dive is over.
It is. We've all got some thinking to do.